Mrs. Owolabi was a successful textile merchant in the heart of Lagos. Though a native of Shagamu, she relocated to Lagos some years ago after her marriage to her husband, Dr. Akin Owolabi. It was on a hot Tuesday afternoon, and Mrs. Owolabi was trying to relax in her shop when her friend, Mrs. Remilekun, walked in with some shopping bags. See who is here. Where are you going and where are you coming from? Mrs. Owolabi asked her friend. Would you believe that I've been in the market since morning? I came to pick a few things for the girls. Do you remember the girls' camp I told you about the last time I came? It's starting this weekend, and I had to get them a few things. Mrs. Remilekun explained to her friend. It's true, how time flies. So it's starting this weekend. I'm sure the girls can't wait to start the loads of fun awaiting them, Mrs. Owolabi said. How did you know? They are beside themselves with joy. Everything now is about the camp. In short, I can't wait for them to go, so I can breathe, said Mrs. Remilekun. Let's see what you have here now. Or is it only for the campers? Mrs. Owolabi said, pointing at the shopping bags. The two women settled under the coolness of the AC in Mrs. Owolabi's shop as they admired the items bought by Mrs. Remilekun. Oh my! Just look at this. This pair of slippers is so beautiful. Oh my ovaries! Where is my baby girl? Mrs. Owolabi said as the two friends burst into laughter. How I wish I had a daughter. Just one is enough. I would have spoilt her silly, Mrs. Owolabi said wistfully. Maybe that's why God didn't give you a daughter. He doesn't want his daughter spoiled silly. He wants his daughters well trained in love, Mrs. Remilekun said jokingly. You don't know how desperately I wish for a girl child. At least someone to always share girl talks with, Mrs. Owolabi stated. My friend, if you know you really want a girl child, give it a shot. Your next pregnancy might just be a girl, you know, Mrs. Remilekun advised. You don't even like me. Have you forgotten how sternly the doctor warned me against getting pregnant again? My husband must not even hear me mention anything pregnancy. Not after the complications that came with the last pregnancy. And personally, I don't think I want to go the pregnancy route again. Because it is better for me to stay alive for my 3 sons than die trying to have a daughter, Mrs. Owolabi concluded. Mrs. Remilekun went ahead to advise her friend to consider adopting one of the numerous orphans, motherless, and destitute who desperately needed help and love. The suggestion sounded okay to Mrs. Owolabi, who promised to discuss the matter with her husband later that day. Dr. Owolabi got home that evening exhausted from the day's work. Welcome, honey. How was your day? Hope you aren't too tired, Mrs. Owolabi asked as she gave her husband a welcome hug. Tired is an understatement. I just need a warm bath, food, bed, and of course, my beautiful wife by my side, Dr. Owolabi replied as he hugged his wife back. Some days after Mrs. Owolabi and her friend Mrs. Remilekun discussed the possibility of adopting a girl child, Mrs. Owolabi, after prayerfully considering the matter, decided to discuss it with her husband. She found him at the mini gym attached to their apartment, sweating out some calories. Honey, what's up? How is it going? She greeted her husband, beaming with smiles. I'm good, dear. This one that you came to join me here. Anything for your boy? Dr. Owolabi asked amusingly. Sure, everything good for you, my darling, she answered. After much persuasions by Mrs. Owolabi, Her husband bought into the idea of adopting a girl just to satisfy his wife's desire, only on the condition that she followed due process without cutting corners. Mrs. Owolabi, who was beside herself with joy, wished she could reduce the distance between her house and her friends, as she couldn't wait to share the news of her husband's readiness with her friend. However, what she had expected wasn't what she met at her friend's place, as she was greeted by a scene which caused the smile she had on her face to freeze. Opening the door to the living room of the Renibarins, Mrs. Owolabi was welcomed by the sight of her friend in company of a younger woman whose face she couldn't place, crying their eyes out. She was lost for the first few minutes, as every attempt to get a clue about the cause of the tears met with more tears. After what seemed like eternity, Mrs. Renibarin motioned her friend to a seat as she wiped her tears with a white handkerchief. "Can someone please tell me what's going on? God forbid, but did someone die? Is your husband fine? What about the children?" She fired series of questions at the crying women. "My husband is fine, and my children too are good," she answered, sniffing. "So, why the tears? Why so much cry?" Mrs. Owolabi further asked in bewilderment. "Labake here is my maternal cousin, who moved to Shagamu some years ago with her family, so as to be close enough to take care of her ailing mother-in-law. She came visiting and was just telling me about recent happenings back in Shagamu. What moved me to tears was Abigail's present pitiable condition as a result of her husband's death," she explained. "Wait, which Abigail? Don't tell me Abigail Adeagbos ni Koka, our former schoolmate at St. Teresa's High School?" Mrs. Owolabi asked in shock. "Yes, it's the same Abigail we both know. I heard she lost her husband last year and has suffered untold hardship in the hands of her in-laws, who stripped her of every valuable, leaving her to single-handedly cater for 4 children," she further explained. "Wow, that's so pathetic. 4 children, single-handedly? I can't imagine," Mrs. Owolabi exclaimed. A while after all agitated emotions had ebbed, Mrs. Renibarin asked her friend why she decided to visit her in the morning, as against the usual after-market visit. In response, Mrs. Owolabi shared the news of her husband's readiness to support the decision of adopting a girl child. That seemed to be the burst of good news Mrs. Renibarin needed to pull her out of the low place that the news of Mrs. Adeagbos' condition had put her emotionally. She promised to give her friend the needed support as she made to walk her to the car. Just as Mrs. Owolabi was about starting the car, a thought lit up in her mind, and she didn't hesitate to share it with her friend. "Wait, doesn't Abigail have a girl child that I could assist her in training? That is, if she wouldn't mind, she suggested to her friend. That's a good one, and I don't think she would mind. At least, that would be less a mouth for her to worry about. Come to think of it, that could even be the reason God brought you to my house at this time of the day, to meet Labake and witness the emotions you just did. I will discuss the modalities of meeting Abigail and the possibility of bringing one of our guests to Lagos with you, with Labake, when I get inside," Mrs. Renibarin informed her friend. A few days after Mrs. Owolabi's visit to her friend, Labake returned to Shagamu and paid Abigail, Mrs. Adeagbos, a visit in order to relay Mrs. Remilekun and Mrs. Owolabi's message to her and also inform her of their intended visit to Shagamu. At first, Mrs. Adeagbos wouldn't hear anything about the possibility of releasing one of her children to be trained by another woman, just because she lacked the financial capacity to do so. It took her several meetings with Labake and some other people well respected by Mommy Remi before she could agree to welcome Mrs. Owolabi and Mrs. Remilekun. After much persuasions, backs and forth, and a lot of tears, Mommy Remi agreed to release her precious daughter, the one who introduced her into the League of Mothers, Remilekun, to the Owolabis, with the promise that the Owolabis would love and protect Remilekun, if need be, with their own very lives. Indeed, some goodbyes are really hard to say, as it was all sorrows, tears and cries as Remilekun was set to leave for Lagos with her new parents. The coolness of the AC proved to be the succor Remilekun needed to overcome the exhaustion caused by the avalanche of tears she had shed at Shagamu as she slept almost all through the journey. She was woken by the honk of the horn instructing Aminu, the gateman, to open the gates to the Owolabi's compound. Remilekun, upon entering the compound with her new parent, was greeted by an edifice that left her mouth opened. She couldn't hide her amazement, as the apartment was all she had imagined in her naive mind and more. Remilekun was shown round the house and taken to her room, which gave her the feeling of a princess, as her new mother, Mrs. Owolabi, had contacted an interior decor expert to make the room a heaven for her with girly themes. Each day was an adventure for Remilekun living with the Owolabis, as they kept introducing her to new experiences and ways of life. Remilekun had no difficulty integrating into her new family, as it was all shades of love, care and attention from them. Her new siblings, the Owolabi boys, proved to be the most courteous children she had ever met. Though very active, they understood what respect and boundaries were, and above all, related with everyone in love. They were so fond of her, and the house was always filled with sounds of Auntie Remi, as they fondly called her in their sophisticated tones. Soon enough, Remilekun was enrolled in a school, one of the most expensive in town. The environment, structures, and everything about the school screamed class, which didn't come cheap. Remilekun woke up each day full of gratitude for the new chance at real joy that God gave her through the Owolabis, and the bitterness she had against God for permitting her father to die when he did began to melt away. Back at Shagamu, things began to ease up for Mommy Remi and the rest of her children, as the Owolabis were magnanimous enough to place her on a monthly allowance of 100,000 naira, an amount that was of great help for feeding and other basic needs, while she focused on garri processing. She was into planting and processing of cassava on a small scale, a venture which not only ensured a steady flow of income for her, but also ensured that she didn't fall into depression. The next 3 years of Remilekun's stay with her new family, the Owolabis, could be described as beyond expectation, as it was all shades of love and affection. She also reciprocated by putting up her best behavior, by being obedient, respectful, and truthful. Though she had a new home with the Owolabis, Remilekun never forgot her people back at Shagamu, as she maintained unbroken interaction with them through voice and video calls as well as periodic visits. It was on a return from such visits in her second term as a final year student in secondary school that she met Dave. Dave was Dr. Owolabi's nephew, who was born and raised in the US. As patriotic Nigerians that his families were, they encouraged him to undergo the compulsory National Youth Service Corps, a scheme designed to integrate Nigerian youth into the different cultures in Nigeria. Dave had just concluded the 3 weeks orientation camp held at the Lagos State Orientation Camp. His uncle, Dr. Owolabi, being an influential man in the state, had influenced his posting to a big production firm in the state. Luckily for Dave, his PPA was in the same axis as the Owolabi's residence. Ultimately, the Owolabi's residence was the ideal place for him to stay. A few weeks after Remilekun wrote her final exams, she took ill and just couldn't keep anything down as she kept vomiting profusely. Her foster father, Dr. Owolabi, saw to it that she was well treated. Upon completing the malaria dose administered by her foster father, Remilekun got better and was back on her feet. However, just like Joy, which has a slender body that breaks too soon, Remilekun's health soon took a downward turn to the shock of her foster family. What could be the nature of Remilekun's sickness? Do you think Remilekun has done something embarrassing? Find out in the next episode.